Welcome back everyone. We're nearing 25k subs. I can't thank you enough. So to celebrate, here's a boozy World War II tale. In the immortal words of Al Murray, all hail to the ale. When it looks like the chips are down and all hope is lost, there's no better morale booster for the British squaddy than a nice cup of tea. Or is there? The Second World War is packed with daring feats and legendary stories of bravery, but there are also some tales that stand out for being downright quirky. One such tale is when the RAF, instead of carrying bombs and bullets, were tasked with bringing a taste of home to the soldiers on the front lines. Because when you're deep in the chaos of war, keeping morale high is just as important as keeping the troops supplied with the essentials. So when the British soldiers stormed Normandy in 1944, they weren't just needing ammo and food, they needed something just as crucial. A good old pint of beer. Sounds trivial, right? However, the situation after D-Day wasn't as simple as grabbing a pint at the local pub. Logistics were focused on getting more urgent supplies, bombs, bullets, and tanks to the front. So you'd think there'd be barely any consideration for luxuries like beer, even though British breweries had generously donated large quantities of it. The problem was always going to be getting it to the troops. On June 20th, 1944, 2 weeks after D-Day, Reuters special correspondent with the Allied forces in France reported to the UK newspapers that the only drink to be found in the newly liberated bars and brasseries just a few miles inland from the breaches was cider. And it is pretty watery stuff. I saw a British private wistfully order a pint of mild and bitter, but the glass he sat down with contained the eternal cider. It wasn't until July 12th that the battling troops in Normandy officially received their first supply of real British beer. Even then, the amount provided was only enough for each soldier to have a single pint, and if you've ever gone on a lash in the UK, you know that's nowhere near enough. This lack of decent booze caused many to write home and to the UK newspapers to lament that there was no beer out there for them in France, and even though the British beer was weaker, about 3% ABV thanks to rationing, the troops didn't care as long as it wasn't that watery cider. However, well before the official deliveries had begun, resourceful RAF and US AAF pilots had already begun their unofficial illicit beer deliveries into northern France on their own, with beer donated by British breweries like Henty and Constable, whose boss, RAF officer Richard Henty, figured a few pints were just the thing to keep his mates going. The booze flights started with a simple yet ingenious idea. Use the pair of 24-gallon expendable fuel tanks, or jettisonable tanks carried under the wings of the Spitfires and Typhoons, typically used for when they needed the fuel for longer missions, and fill them up with beer. Despite the lack of official approval from the Air Ministry, a cheeky photograph was sent to the newspapers showing a Spitfire of 332 Norwegian squadron at Tangmere Airfield in Sussex, having its 45-gallon jettison tank being filled with beer from 2 wooden casks supplied by the Chichester brewery Henty and Constable. It was a classic case of, it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. The first beer run kicked off June 13th, 1944, D-Day +7. 3 Spitfire Mark 9Bs took off from Tangmere, England, aiming for an airstrip near Benny-sur-Mer, 100 miles away in Normandy. Flight Lieutenant Lloyd Berryman of 412 Squadron was chosen to lead the charge. His wing commander, Keith Hudson, instructed him to transport the generous beer donation under the guise that the mission was hush-hush, motivated by rumors that the Nazis had poisoned the water supplies. In the words of Berryman, the instructions went something like this: get a couple of other pilots and arrange with the officers' mess to steam out the jettison tanks and load them up with beer. When we get over the beachhead, drop out of formation and land on the strip. We're told the Nazis are fouling the drinking water, so it will be appreciated. There's no trouble finding the strip. The battleship Rodney is firing salvos on Cairn, and it's immediately below. We'll be flying over at 13,000 feet, so the beer will be cold enough when you arrive. I remember getting Murray Haver from Hamilton and a third pilot, whose name escapes me, to carry out the caper. In reflection, it now seems like an appropriate Air Force gesture for which the Urks, also known as infantrymen, would be most appreciative. By the time I got down to 5,000, the welcoming from the Rodney was hardly inviting. But sure enough, there was the strip. Wheels down and in we go. 3 spits with 90-gallon jettisonable tanks fully loaded with cool beer. As I rolled to the end of the mesh runway, it was hard to figure. There was absolutely no one in sight. What do we do now? I wondered. We can't just sit here and wait for someone to show up. What's with the communications? Finally, I saw someone peering out at us from behind a tree, and I waved frantically to get him out to the aircraft. Sure enough, out bounds this army type, and he climbs onto the wing with the welcome, "What the hell are you doing here?" Whereupon he got the short, but nevertheless terse, version of the story. "Look," he said, "can you see that church steeple at the far end of the strip? Well, it's loaded with German snipers, and we've been all day trying to clear them out, so you better drop your tanks and bugger off before it's too late." In moments, we were out of there, but such was the welcoming for the first Spitfire at our airstrip in Normandy. 4 days later, more Spitfires from 416 Squadron, a Royal Canadian Air Force, made another delivery of booze to the newly built airfield at Bazenville, just a few miles from the Gold Beach, and as the demand for cold pints escalated in Normandy, the Spitfires were joined by pilots of the RAF 123 wing, flying Typhoons, and based at Martrangi. These pilots would run reconnaissance flights back to the southern English airfield at Shoreham, where a local brewery would quickly fill the Typhoon's 2 wing-mounted 90-gallon jettison tanks with beer, after which the pilot would then zip back across the channel to Martrangi. Unfortunately, the Typhoon's uncanny resemblance to the German Focke-Wulf 190, which was no surprise since it took much inspiration from the FW-190, led to occasional mishaps. Sometimes inexperienced United States Army Air Force P-47 Thunderbolt pilots mistook the British fighters for the German aircraft and attacked the beer-laden planes. According to 123 Wings Commanding Officer, Group Captain Desmond Scott, our aerial Brewer's Dray was attacked by American Thunderbolts twice in one day and was forced to jettison its beer tanks into the channel. Beer cost us money, and these 2 encounters proved expensive. The Wings draft beer flights came to a sudden halt, and Scott had to arrange for an old twin-engined Anson to fly in cases of Guinness. The troops mixed it with champagne to produce black velvet. It was hardly a Cockney's drink, but they appeared to like it, he wrote. But it was not long before the US AAF pilots started to copy the RAF beer runs. Lieutenant William R. Dunn of the 513th Fighter Squadron, a P-47 Thunderbolt pilot, recalled in his book, Fighter Pilot, the first American ace of World War II. During our brief stay at A6 Airfield, we learnt another trick of the trade from our neighbouring RAF allies. A Typhoon squadron based near Cairn, periodically they'd send a kite with a clean belly tank back to England, where the tank was filled with beer. A flight back to France at an altitude of around 15,000 feet, and the beer arrived nice and cold. We soon followed their lead, and with our 150-gallon belly tanks, those British types sure knew how to take all the comforts from home to war with them. Although illicit beer runs were not the only source of booze for the Americans, when a local French farmer supplied a case of the local tipple. Our friend, the French farmer, gave us a keg of Calvados, which we set upon a small table next to the admin tent. Now, Calvados is some powerful drink. A couple of sips and it starts creeping up on you. A couple more sips and the lights go out. Within an hour, we had to hang on to the grass to keep from falling off the earth. My advice to anyone regarding Calvados is to leave it alone. However, a solution had to be found to address the problem with the beer being fouled by the taste of petrol, not to mention that the jettisonable tanks were made from vulcanized paper fiber, which did nothing to improve the metallic aftertaste in the brew. It is disputed who came up with the solution. Some say that it was the pilots with the RAF's No. 131 Polish wing flying Spitfire Mark 9s who had the idea not to bother with emptying the beer into the drop tanks, but rather instead attach the wooden barrels directly to the Spitfire's bomb racks, then add a streamlined nose cone to create the beer bomb. As word of the beer runs spread through the squadrons, pilots started to get themselves organized. Thorstein Tony Johnson of 65 Squadron, flying P-51 Mustangs out of Martrangi, set up a weekly beer run to Croydon Aerodrome. 2 75-gallon tanks, one bitter, one mild, Soon, their airstrip pub was the hottest spot in Normandy, pulling in pilots, crew, and even local ladies. Demand spiked, so they upped it to twice a week. Woe to any pilot who botched a landing and spilt the goods. In time, the bomb rack fittings of the Spitfire were modified to attach an 18-gallon barrel, an installation known as the Mod 30 depth charge. Even the renowned wing commander Johnny Johnson in his book Wing Leader recounts having beer delivered to St. Croix, where he was based in France. His fellow pilots were becoming bored with a monotonous diet of tinned rations, missing fresh meat, milk, and fruit juices, and wanting fresh bread instead of the hard biscuits. Having noted that there was a daily postal flight between St. Croix and Tangmere, and hearing of some ingenious mind had modified the bomb racks under the wing of the Spitfire to carry small barrels of beer instead of a 500-pound bomb, he decided to start up his own home comfort supply runs, a bit like Uber Eats, but with Spitfires and a war zone. He penned a letter to Arthur King, the landlord of his local, the Unicorn pub in Chichester. He explained to King the desperate situation they were in, and if he could, would he arrange to deliver to Tangmere a supply of fresh vegetables, bread, and perhaps some meat, and the pilot of the Anson would do the rest. The next day, the Anson arrived back at St. Croix, loaded with tomatoes, loaves of fresh bread, succulent lobsters, and a reasonable supply of stout. This arrangement continued up until a small party of press correspondents stopped by Johnson insisted on having them stay for lunch, and over some bottles of local French wine and lobsters, the journalists inquired as to the provenance of the lobsters and other luxuries, whereby he divulged his agreement with Arthur King back in England. As you can imagine, journalists, seeing a good morale-boosting story, published it in one of the national newspapers. Unfortunately, this article also caught the attention of an officious little representative of His Majesty's Customs and Excise. He decided to visit Arthur King to inform him that an export license would be necessary if he persisted in this sort of thing, raising concerns about exporting beer abroad without paying taxes. However, as the Allied war continued across France and supply lines improved, regular beer shipments came through more official routes. But for a time, these beer runs remained a semi-secret operation that embodied the British spirit of innovation and perseverance. By July 44, some estimate the RAF hauled over 1,000 gallons of beer across the Channel, enough to fill a small swimming pool for the lads. As time went on, the Americans, impressed by the ingenuity of the British, began to follow suit. The US Army started shipping more beer to their troops abroad and even developing versions of the beer run, including the famous story of P-47 Thunderbolts hauling ice cream for the GIs. There are many instances where pilots across the world used ingenious methods to get booze to the front, such as the P-51s being used to fly over the hump in Indochina known as the Gin Run and Old Glory, the B-25 that was borrowed by a squadron of P-38 pilots as their personal beer hauler. By November 1944, the government decided to make things official. Beer supplies for the troops were now organized, ensuring that soldiers could access at least 5% of the country's beer production. While not a strategic game-changer, they left a lasting legend, reflecting camaraderie and the British love for a pint, even in war. To end this story, returning to Berryman from earlier in the story, in the 1950s at Ford Motor Company in Windsor, where he was employed at the time, he recounts the time when a chap arrived to discuss some business and inquired if he had been in the Air Force. "Yes, indeed," I responded. "Did you by chance land at Beny-sur-Mer and Normandy with 2 other Spitfires with jettison tanks loaded with beer?" he asked. "Yes, for sure I did," I answered, "but how on earth could you possibly be aware of that?" "Well, I'll tell you," he said. "I was the guy who climbed on your wing and told you to bugger off." We finished the afternoon reminiscing. I want to say a big thanks to my Patreon crew. You lot keep the pints flowing for these stories. So, a huge thanks to Ed, Chris Sen, Will Eichler, Linus Hermanson, Arneson Cato, Kevin Hansen, Morrison Ward, Ethan Escrow, The Late Bird 7, Alex Porter, and Satcha Botbol for being patrons of the channel.